Welcome to Sinister Stories, where the shadows hold more than just secrets. If you're a fan of the dark and the twisted, you're in the right place. Tonight, we dive into a tale that will send chills down your spine. Before we begin, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss a single spine-tingling story. I've always loved trains. The rhythmic clatter of wheels against steel rails, the hum of engines, and the bustling energy of train stations always felt like a promise of adventure. When I saw the job posting for a night shift attendant at Grand Central Station, the $32 an hour pay rate made it impossible to pass up. Sure, the hours were odd, but the idea of working in one of the most iconic places in New York City felt almost romantic. At least, it did until I saw the rules. I arrived for my first shift at 10 p.m., the last echoes of rush hour commuters dissipating into the night. Grand Central was breathtakingly beautiful, even when nearly deserted. The vast domed ceiling sparkled with its mural of constellations, and the marble floors gleamed under the dim lights. It felt alive in a way that I couldn't quite explain, like the station itself was watching me. My new boss, Mr. Donovan, was waiting near the information booth. He was a wiry man in his late 50s with a sharp suit and a sharper gaze. "You're punctual," he said, glancing at his watch. "Good. Follow me." He led me to a small office tucked away behind a maze of hallways. Inside, a cluttered desk and an old clock dominated the room. A thick binder sat in the center of the desk, its cover marked with the words, "Rules for Night Personnel." "Read this carefully," Donovan said, sliding the binder toward me. "These aren't your usual guidelines. Following them isn't optional. It's survival." I chuckled nervously, but Donovan's expression didn't waver. "You're serious?" I asked. "Dead serious," he replied. "This station isn't just a hub for trains. It's complicated. Things happen here at night that don't make sense. The rules will keep you safe. Violate them, and you won't make it till dawn." I swallowed hard and opened the binder. The first page was titled, "Rules for the Night Shift." Beneath it, a numbered list filled the page. At 11:11 p.m., stand at the central clock and announce the time loudly. You must do this alone. Never look directly into the glass of the ticket counter after midnight. If you hear footsteps behind you in the main concourse, do not turn around. Between 2 a.m. and 2:15 a.m., the constellation mural will shift. Do not observe it for longer than 30 seconds. If a man in a gray suit asks for the ghost line, direct him to track 61. Do not follow him. At 3:33 a.m., the clock above the information booth will stop. Wind it manually within 5 minutes. If you hear a train arrive after the last scheduled departure, do not approach the platform. I stared at the list, my unease growing with each rule. This had to be some kind of elaborate joke. But when I looked up, Donovan's grim expression told me otherwise. "You'll start tonight," he said, handing me a flashlight and a set of keys. "Stay alert and for God's sake follow the rules." The first couple of hours were uneventful. I walked the length of the station, marveling at its empty grandeur. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional creak of old wood or the distant rumble of a subway train. I almost convinced myself that Donovan's rules were just hazing for new hires, until the clock struck 11:11 p.m. Standing beneath the iconic central clock, I felt a strange pressure in the air, like the atmosphere had thickened. Remembering the first rule, I hesitated before clearing my throat and announcing, "The time is 11:11 p.m. My voice echoed unnaturally in the empty hall, and for a moment, I swore the clock's hands paused before continuing their sweep. "Good," came a whisper from behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. The vast hall stretched out, empty and still. My heart pounded as I tried to rationalize the voice. It must have been the acoustics playing tricks on me. By midnight, the station's atmosphere had changed. The shadows seemed darker, stretching unnaturally across the marble floor. I approached the ticket counter, remembering the second rule. The glass reflected the dim lights and something else. I could see my own reflection, but behind me there was movement. A tall, shadowy figure stood just out of focus. I froze, my instincts screaming to turn around. Instead, I squeezed my eyes shut and stepped away, heart hammering. When I opened them again, the glass was clear, and the figure was gone. The night continued in this vein, each rule presenting a new, surreal challenge. At 2 a.m., I forced myself to glance at the mural. The constellations were shifting, their stars gliding across the painted sky like fireflies. It was mesmerizing, but I counted the seconds and looked away before the allure could trap me. By the time 3:33 a.m. approached, I was exhausted but alert. The clock above the information booth stopped abruptly, its hands frozen. I scrambled to wind it, my shaking hands barely managing the task within the 5-minute window. When the shift ended at 6 a.m., I felt like I'd aged a decade. Donovan was waiting in the office, his expression unreadable. "You survived your first night," he said. "Not everyone does. Go home, rest, and come back tonight. It only gets harder from here." I wanted to quit, to leave and never set foot in Grand Central again. But something about the experience, the rules, the shadows, the mysteries, called to me. I needed to understand what was happening, even if it meant risking everything. I returned for my second shift carrying the weight of what I had experienced the previous night. The rational part of me screamed to quit, to walk away before I was swallowed whole by whatever secrets Grand Central Station held. But something about the rules, the shadows, and the strange occurrences called to me like a puzzle begging to be solved. As I entered the cavernous main concourse, the station felt more alive and less welcoming. The golden light from the chandeliers seemed dimmer, casting longer shadows. The once comforting hum of distant trains now sounded like faint whispers, unintelligible but chilling all the same. Donovan greeted me at the office with a nod. "Good to see you back," he said, his tone devoid of the usual small talk. "You must have felt it last night, the station's quirks. They're stronger tonight." "What do you mean, stronger?" I asked. "You'll see," he replied cryptically. Then he handed me the keys and flashlight. "Follow the rules no matter what." The first couple of hours were uneventful but nerve-wracking. Every creak, every shadow, every draft of cold air felt like an omen. I found myself compulsively checking my watch, counting down to the first task, announcing the time beneath the central clock at 11:11 p.m. When the moment arrived, I stood under the grand clock, its ornate face looming above me. "The time is 11:11 p.m., I announced, my voice echoing eerily in the empty hall. This time there was no whisper or otherworldly acknowledgement. Instead, the lights above flickered briefly, plunging the hall into semi-darkness before stabilizing. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach but pressed on, completing my patrols and mentally ticking off the rules as they applied. At midnight, I avoided the ticket counter's reflective glass, the memory of the shadowy figure from the previous night fresh in my mind. The reflection stayed normal as long as I kept my gaze low and moved quickly past it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lingering just beyond my periphery. Shortly after midnight, I heard footsteps echoing through the concourse. I froze in place, heart pounding as they grew louder, heavier, until they seemed mere inches behind me. The urge to turn around was overwhelming, primal, but I gritted my teeth and stayed rooted. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and the oppressive silence that followed left my nerves frayed. Then came the man in the gray suit. He appeared near the ticket counter, his arrival so sudden it was as though he had materialized from the shadows. He was tall, impeccably dressed, his suit and polished shoes reminiscent of another era. His face was pale and unnervingly blank, his eyes void of warmth or emotion. "Excuse me," he said in a flat, toneless voice. "Could you direct me to the ghost line?" Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to remember the fifth rule. If a man in a gray suit asks for the ghost line, direct him to track 61. Do not follow him. My throat was dry as I gestured toward the far end of the station. Track 61 is that way. The man inclined his head in a small mechanical nod. "Thank you." He turned and walked away, his footsteps unnervingly silent on the marble floor. I watched him disappear into the shadows near track 61. For a brief, terrifying moment, I felt an inexplicable pull to follow him, as though an invisible thread were tugging at my very being. It took all my willpower to stay where I was. The air near track 61 was noticeably colder when I passed it during my patrol. The platform was bathed in a strange bluish light that seemed to pulse faintly, like the heartbeat of something alive. I didn't dare step closer, but I strained my ears, catching the faint sound of a train's whistle in the distance. No train was scheduled to arrive at this hour. At 3:33 a.m., I was prepared for the clock to stop. The hands froze as expected, and I quickly climbed the ladder to wind it manually. As the gears resumed their ticking, a deep rumble echoed through the station. I froze. The sound of a train approaching grew louder, accompanied by a strange, otherworldly hum that vibrated in my chest. Against every instinct, I hurried to the nearest platform to confirm what I feared. A train was pulling into the station. Its exterior was impossibly black, a void that seemed to absorb the dim light around it. The windows were opaque, hiding whatever, or whoever, was inside. As it came to a stop, the doors hissed open, revealing an empty interior lit by a faint green glow. I didn't approach. I didn't dare. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement on the far end of the platform. A figure stood there, silhouetted against the green glow of the train. It was the man in the gray suit. He turned toward me, his face still eerily blank. For a moment, I thought he would step onto the train, but instead, he raised a hand and beckoned silently. I took a step back, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. The man tilted his head as though curious before stepping onto the train. The doors closed behind him, and with a mechanical groan, the train began to pull away. As it disappeared into the tunnel, the oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly avoided something worse than death. By the time 6 a.m. arrived, I was physically and mentally drained. Donovan was waiting for me in the office, his expression unreadable. "Anything unusual tonight?" he asked. I hesitated before nodding. A train arrived, one that wasn't on the schedule. His face darkened. "Did you board it?" "No," I said quickly. "Good," he replied. "Never get on the ghost line. Whatever you do, stay away from that train." I wanted to press him for more answers, but he waved me off with a curt, "Get some rest. You'll need it for tomorrow." As I left the station, the haunting image of the man in the gray suit boarding the ghostly train lingered in my mind. When I arrived for my third shift, I was surprised to find Mr. Donovan wasn't in the office. His absence unnerved me. I had so many questions about the station, the rules, and the strange man in the gray suit. But his desk was empty, save for the ever-present binder of rules. A note had been taped to its cover. "You're on your own tonight. Stick to the rules." As if I needed reminding. The station was even more oppressive this time, its emptiness like a living thing. Shadows clung to corners they hadn't before, and the faint scent of old, damp stone seemed stronger. As I started my rounds, I couldn't shake the feeling that the station was expecting something, or someone. At 11:11 p.m., I performed the usual ritual at the central clock. This time, as my voice echoed through the grand hall, I heard faint laughter in the distance. It wasn't joyful. It was low and raspy, like the laughter of someone who'd long forgotten what humor was. I gritted my teeth and ignored it, refusing to let it rattle me. The first few hours passed without major incident. By now I had developed a rhythm. Follow the rules, stay alert, and try not to think too hard about what I'd seen or heard. But around 1:45 a.m., as I passed through the whispering galleries near the oyster bar, I noticed something unusual. One of the side doors, typically locked tight, was ajar. I hesitated, my flashlight beam illuminating the small brass plate above the door. Platform 13. I frowned. I'd never seen this door open before. In fact, I wasn't sure I'd ever noticed it at all. Every rational part of me screamed to turn around, but curiosity gnawed at me. Was this another test? A trap? The rules didn't mention Platform 13, but somehow that made it feel even more dangerous. I stepped closer, my heart hammering in my chest. Beyond the door, a narrow staircase spiraled down into darkness. The air was colder here, each breath a visible puff. I aimed my flashlight down the stairs but couldn't see the bottom. As I debated whether to descend, I heard a voice behind me, a soft, mournful whisper. "Don't go." I whipped around, but the hall was empty. The voice, however, lingered in the air like smoke. It didn't feel malicious, but it carried a weight of despair that sent shivers down my spine. Heeding the warning, I pulled the door shut and locked it, though the unease lingered long after I walked away. At 2 a.m., I made my way to the main concourse and glanced at the constellation mural, just as the rules instructed. As before, the stars shifted, rearranging themselves into strange patterns, but this time the movement was faster, more erratic. The stars seemed to pulse, their light dimming and flaring like a heartbeat. I counted the seconds, 26, 27, 28, and tore my gaze away before I could hit 30. A deep, resonant hum filled the air, vibrating in my chest. When I looked back, the mural was still. The sense of being watched grew stronger after that. Shadows darted in my peripheral vision, and faint whispers tickled my ears, though I couldn't make out the words. Then, at 3 a.m., the whispering stopped. The station fell silent. Not the usual silence of the night, but an oppressive, absolute silence. No creaking of old wood, no distant rumble of trains. Even my own footsteps sounded muffled. I checked the clock above the information booth, anticipating the 3:33 rule. But as I stood beneath it, the air grew heavy, pressing down on my shoulders like an invisible weight. That's when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A figure stood on one of the platforms, platform 13. It was barely visible in the dim light, but it was there, tall, hunched, and unmoving. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams that refused to settle on the figure. I couldn't tell if it was facing me or looking away, but I felt its gaze nonetheless. A cold dread seeped into my bones. The rules didn't cover this. What was I supposed to do? Then I remembered the man in the gray suit, his monotone voice asking for the ghost line. Could this figure be connected to him? My mind raced as I fumbled with my flashlight, trying to force the beam to stay steady. The figure took a step forward. I froze. Another step. The clock chimed once, 3:33 a.m. The sound jolted me into action. I bolted toward the information booth, grabbing the clock's winding key with shaking hands. The figure continued to approach, its steps slow and deliberate. My fingers fumbled with the clock, each second stretching into an eternity. Just as the figure reached the edge of the platform, I managed to wind the clock. Its hands resumed their motion with a soft click, and the oppressive silence shattered. When I looked back at platform 13, the figure was gone. By the time my shift ended, I was barely holding it together. Donovan was still absent, and the note remained taped to the binder. I wanted answers, but more than that, I wanted sleep. As I left the station, I glanced back at the central clock. For a split second, I thought I saw the figure reflected in its glass, standing in the concourse. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. By the time I arrived for my fourth shift, the oppressive atmosphere of Grand Central Station had become almost familiar. The note Donovan left behind the previous night had disappeared, replaced with the usual silent indifference of the empty office. Yet a new unease settled over me. The events of the prior night replayed in my mind. The open door to platform 13, the figure that had emerged, and the strange hum from the constellation mural. The binder of rules was still on the desk. I opened it out of habit, skimming the pages for anything I might have missed. A new page had been added, its edges slightly yellowed, the handwriting different from the rest. If the door to platform 13 opens, close it immediately and do not descend. Do not approach the figures you see on any platform. At 4:44 a.m., you may hear footsteps behind you. Do not turn around. Keep walking until they stop. I stared at the rules, my stomach sinking. Had someone been watching me? How else would they know about platform 13 or the figure I saw? And what fresh horror awaited me at 4:44 a.m.? I tucked the binder under my arm and began my rounds, heart pounding with every step. The station felt alive tonight, its shadows deeper, its whispers louder. The air was colder than usual, as though something had seeped into the station from a place it didn't belong. 12:45 a.m. I was patrolling the East Wing when I heard it, the faint creak of a door opening. My blood ran cold. Following the sound, I found myself standing before the door to platform 13 again. It was ajar, just as it had been the night before, and the icy draft emanating from the stairwell sent chills down my spine. This time I didn't hesitate. I slammed the door shut and twisted the lock into place. The sound echoed through the corridor, unnaturally loud in the stillness. As I turned to leave, I heard the whisper again, the same mournful voice as before. "You shouldn't be here." I spun around, but the hall was empty. The voice lingered, a faint echo that made my skin crawl. Clutching the binder like a lifeline, I forced myself to move on. 2 a.m. I reached the main concourse and looked up at the constellation mural. The stars were already moving, faster and more erratically than ever before. The patterns were nonsensical, yet they tugged at something deep within me, a primal part of my brain that screamed to look away. I counted the seconds aloud. 1, 2, 3. At 29, I tore my gaze away. This time, the hum that followed was louder, almost deafening. It vibrated through the floor, rattling the glass panes of the ticket booths. I pressed my hands over my ears and stumbled toward the exit of the concourse. When the hum finally subsided, I dared to glance back. The mural was still again, its stars locked in their eternal dance. But something had changed. A single star near the center was glowing brighter than the rest, its light a deep pulsating red. 3:15 a.m. I was checking the waiting room when I noticed the air had grown even colder. My breath came out in visible puffs, and frost clung to the edges of the benches. A faint sound reached my ears, like the distant rumble of a train. But the tracks were silent, and no trains had run through the station at this hour in years. The sound grew louder, resolving into something more distinct, the rhythmic clatter of wheels on rails. It seemed to come from below, deep beneath the station. I followed it, my steps echoing down the empty halls, until I reached a service elevator tucked away in a forgotten corner. The elevator doors slid open on their own, revealing a narrow, dimly lit interior. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But something compelled me forward, an unseen force urging me to step inside. The doors closed behind me with a soft hiss and the elevator began to descend. The ride was agonizingly slow, the elevator's groan echoing in the confined space. After what felt like an eternity, the doors opened to reveal a cavernous chamber. The walls were rough-hewn stone, glistening with moisture, and the air was heavy with the scent of earth and decay. Tracks crisscrossed the floor, their rails rusted and broken in places. In the center of the chamber stood an old locomotive, its black metal gleaming faintly in the dim light. The engine's windows were shattered, and its front was marred with deep gouges, as though something had clawed at it. Despite its disrepair, the locomotive exuded a sense of malevolence, as if it were alive. I approached cautiously, the binder clutched tightly in my hands. As I neared the engine, I noticed symbols etched into its side, strange runes that seemed to writhe and shift when I looked at them. A low growl echoed through the chamber, and the shadows around the locomotive seemed to ripple. "Who are you?" I whispered, though I wasn't sure whom I was addressing. The growl grew louder, and the air seemed to vibrate with an unseen force. Then, without warning, the locomotive's headlights flared to life, bathing the chamber in an eerie yellow glow. I stumbled back, shielding my eyes. When I lowered my arm, I saw them. Figures standing along the tracks, their forms hazy and indistinct. They seemed to flicker, as though caught between this world and another. Their eyes glowed faintly, fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The growl deepened, turning into a deafening roar. The figures began to move, their steps slow and deliberate, closing in on me from all sides. Panic surged through me, and I turned back toward the elevator, my feet slipping on the damp stone. As I reached the doors, I felt a hand brush against my shoulder, cold and insubstantial, yet undeniably real. I lunged into the elevator, slamming my fist against the button for the upper floors. The doors closed just as the first of the figures reached the threshold. The ride back up was silent, save for my ragged breathing. When the doors opened, I stumbled out into the familiar halls of Grand Central Station, the binder still clutched in my trembling hands. The air here felt warmer, safer, though the sense of being watched never fully faded. 4:44 a.m. I was halfway through my final patrol when I heard it. Footsteps behind me, echoing in perfect time with my own. My heart raced as I remembered the rule: do not turn around. Keep walking until they stop. The footsteps grew louder, heavier, as though whoever was following me was just inches away. I quickened my pace, resisting the urge to glance over my shoulder. The hallway stretched on endlessly, the shadows seeming to close in around me. Finally, the footsteps ceased. I let out a shaky breath and turned a corner, collapsing against the wall. My shift was almost over, but I knew the station wasn't done with me yet. The fifth night felt different even before I stepped inside Grand Central. The air outside was colder than usual, biting through my jacket and pricking at my skin. The station's exterior loomed against the night sky, the ornate stonework casting jagged shadows under the streetlights. For a moment I considered turning back, but curiosity had its hooks in me. Inside, the station was unusually dark. Only a few dim lights flickered in the grand hall, leaving most of the space shrouded in shadow. As I approached the office, I found no note, no sign of Donovan. The binder sat untouched on the desk, its presence a stark reminder of the rules that had kept me alive so far. I walked the concourse slowly, every sound amplified in the oppressive quiet. At 11:11 p.m., I made my announcement beneath the central clock. The echoes of my voice faded into the vastness, but this time, there was no laughter, no whispers, just an unnerving stillness. By midnight, the station's atmosphere had shifted again. The air was heavy, suffused with a faint metallic tang that reminded me of blood. I avoided the ticket counter's glass, keeping my gaze fixed on the ground as I passed. Shadows flickered along the edges of my vision, but I refused to acknowledge them. At 1 a.m., I heard footsteps echoing from the concourse, steady and deliberate. The sound grew louder, circling me, though no one was there. I stood frozen, fighting the urge to turn around. After a moment, the footsteps stopped, and the oppressive silence returned. Then, at 2:15 a.m., the constellation mural began its shift. The stars didn't just move. They rippled as if the ceiling were a vast inverted pool of water. The constellations morphed into unfamiliar shapes, their light pulsing erratically. I counted to 30 and looked away, my heart pounding in my chest. But it was the arrival of the train that marked the beginning of the night's true terror. At 3:45 a.m., the rumble of wheels on tracks filled the station. It wasn't subtle or distant. It was a full, thunderous roar, as if a locomotive were charging directly through the main concourse. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my grip. The train screeched to a halt, the sound piercing and unnatural. When I turned toward track 61, I saw it. A gleaming, pitch-black train with no markings, its surface reflecting the dim lights of the station. Steam billowed from its engine, curling like ghostly tendrils around the platform. Passengers began to disembark. At first glance, they looked normal. Men in suits, women in elegant dresses, children clutching their parents' hands. But as they moved, something felt off. Their motions were too fluid, almost serpentine, and their faces lacked definition, like smeared charcoal drawings. One by one, they stepped off the train and onto the platform, their footsteps eerily silent despite their numbers. None of them acknowledged my presence, but I felt their collective gaze, an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. I remembered Rule 7, do not approach the platform. Backing away, I tried to steady my breathing. The passengers continued to emerge, an endless stream of distorted figures. Some carried luggage that seemed to melt and reform in their hands. Others floated just above the ground, their feet never touching the marble floor. Then, from the shadows of the concourse, another figure emerged. It was the man in the gray suit. His presence was sharper than the others, more defined. He moved with purpose, his pale face and hollow eyes locked onto me. My legs felt rooted to the floor as he approached, his polished shoes clicking against the tiles. "Where is the conductor?" he asked, his voice low and resonant. I don't know," I stammered, my throat dry. He tilted his head, studying me with a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You shouldn't be here," he said softly. But since you are, consider this a warning." Before I could respond, he turned and walked toward the train. The passengers parted for him, their movements synchronized like a single entity. He stepped aboard, disappearing into the darkened car. The train's whistle blew, a shrill, bone-chilling sound that echoed through the station. The passengers began boarding again, their forms dissolving into smoke as they stepped through the doors. Within moments, the platform was empty. The train let out another piercing whistle and began to move, its wheels grinding against the tracks. As it pulled away, the air grew colder, and the oppressive silence returned. I stood there, shaken, until the faint rumble of the departing train faded completely. When the clock struck 6 a.m., I returned to the office. Donovan was still nowhere to be found. On the desk, a new note had appeared, written in a hand that wasn't his. "The rules won't save you forever." The sixth night weighed on me before it even began. Grand Central felt more oppressive with each shift, as if the station itself were testing my limits. The rules had kept me alive so far, but Donovan's absence and the cryptic note left behind haunted me. What did it mean? The rules won't save you forever. The air inside the station was colder than usual that night, each breath forming wispy clouds that quickly dissipated. The lights flickered erratically as I made my rounds, their intermittent glow casting eerie, distorted shadows across the marble floor. At 11:11 p.m., I stood beneath the central clock and made my announcement. My voice felt swallowed by the station, as if the sound didn't echo but was absorbed into the very walls. This time, a faint shuffling noise followed my words. It wasn't footsteps, but something heavier, dragging across the floor far away in the shadows. I forced myself to move on, the rules replaying in my head like a mantra. As midnight passed, I avoided the ticket counter entirely. The reflection in the glass no longer felt like a trick of the light. I didn't trust myself not to look. But the real terror began at 2 a.m. I was patrolling the western end of the concourse when the faint sound of dripping water caught my attention. It was strange because Grand Central was usually bone dry, yet the sound persisted, steady, rhythmic. Following it, I found myself at the entrance to a service tunnel I hadn't noticed before. The metal gate that usually blocked it was ajar, the padlock dangling uselessly from its latch. I knew I shouldn't go in. The rules didn't mention anything about tunnels, but every instinct screamed that this was wrong. Yet something about the sound, the steady drip, 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 compelled me to step closer. Shining my flashlight into the darkness, I saw that the tunnel sloped downward, its brick walls damp and glistening. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something metallic. I hesitated, then turned to leave, when I heard a voice. "Help me." It was faint, distant, but unmistakably human. Against my better judgment, I called out, "Who's there?" The voice didn't respond, but the dripping noise grew louder, echoing ominously through the tunnel. My flashlight flickered as I stepped closer to the entrance, the beam barely piercing the oppressive dark. "Help me," the voice repeated, closer this time. Every rational part of me screamed to turn back, to follow the rules and stay away from the unknown. But the plea was desperate, haunting. If someone was trapped down there, I took a single step into the tunnel. Instantly, the air changed. The temperature plummeted and the walls seemed to close in around me. My flashlight flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows that danced and twisted unnaturally. The dripping sound was deafening now, each drop echoing like a drumbeat in my skull. "Help me," the voice said again, now directly behind me. I spun around, heart racing, but there was nothing there. The tunnel was empty, stretching into blackness in both directions. The shadows on the walls moved as if alive, writhing and shifting beyond the reach of my flashlight. Then, I saw it. At the far end of the tunnel, something enormous stirred. Its form was obscured by the darkness, but its glowing eyes, two pinpricks of sickly yellow light, pierced the void. The dripping sound wasn't water. It was coming from it. The creature began to move, its massive shape scraping against the walls of the tunnel as it advanced. The sound was wet and grating, like flesh dragging against stone. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight as panic set in. The rules. What were the rules? None of them mentioned this. The creature let out a low, guttural growl that reverberated through the tunnel, shaking the ground beneath my feet. Its eyes locked onto me, unblinking and hungry. And then it spoke. "You don't belong here." Its voice was a deep, guttural rasp, layered with an otherworldly echo. It felt less like sound and more like a vibration that rattled my bones. I was just... I stammered, backing toward the tunnel entrance. It didn't let me finish. The creature lunged, its massive form moving with terrifying speed. I turned and ran, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly as I sprinted back toward the concourse. The sound of its pursuit, wet, heavy, relentless, grew louder with every step. When I burst out of the tunnel and into the open space of the station, the creature stopped. I turned to see it lingering in the shadows just beyond the entrance, its glowing eyes fixed on me. It growled, low and menacing, before retreating into the darkness. The gate slammed shut behind it, the padlock snapping back into place as if it had never been broken. I collapsed onto the marble floor, gasping for breath. My entire body trembled as I tried to process what had just happened. The rules hadn't prepared me for this. Whatever lurked beneath Grand Central was beyond anything I'd imagined. As I sat there, the station's oppressive silence returned, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. And then I heard it. The faint, distant sound of a train whistle. The clang of distant footsteps echoed through the cavernous halls, rhythmic and insistent, like a drumbeat at the edge of sanity. I tried to keep my breathing even, to drown out the raw, metallic thud of my pulse in my ears. The station's light seemed dimmer now, as though the tired bulbs above were flickering in sympathy with my fear. It was just past midnight, and the terminal should have been empty, but I felt as if I were being watched by a multitude of unseen eyes. Rule 4, which had been scribbled down in stark, sharp letters on the first night of my orientation, echoed in my mind. If you hear footsteps, don't look. They aren't real, but they will know if you do. I stood at my post by the information desk, the map in front of me still illuminated, its fluorescent colors flickering like a heartbeat. I stared at the blotches of red and blue that represented the trains, and at the green paths that led nowhere I could recognize, a mockery of routes that no one could take. The footsteps grew louder, a precise, deliberate sound. I dared a glance at the grand clock, its gilded face glowing like a pale moon in the dark. 12:15 a.m. I glanced toward the darkened corridor leading to track 12. A shiver crawled up my spine when I saw a shadow shift, just for a moment, as if the darkness itself had moved. A deep voice, gravelly and far too close, whispered from behind me. Rule 5. A whistle means someone's coming. It's best not to be here when they do. I spun around, the sensation of being caught mid-breath making my chest ache. But there was nothing, no one, just the thin, wavy air shimmering with heat rising from the dusty floor. I swallowed hard, shaking my head, and forced myself to return to my post. The rules said not to panic. I needed to keep it together. A sharp, cold draft made me shiver. I looked up at the roof, cracked and peeling in places, and saw a strange light moving in one of the high, dirty windows. It looked like the silhouette of a man, but his head was tilted back at an impossible angle, eyes shining like twin lanterns in the dimness. He didn't move, and for a moment, neither did I. I couldn't look away, not even when the echo of a sharp, whistling wind rushed through the station, causing the dry, paper-thin advertisements to rustle as if in terror. Suddenly the lights flickered back to life, a warm, steady illumination that felt almost welcoming. But it was a brief reprieve. A sharp, piercing whistle cut through the gloom, so shrill it made my ears sting. I felt an irresistible urge to turn toward the source, toward the corridor where the whistle had come from, but the rules stopped me cold. I had to move, to check the back hallway where the sound had come from. If I stayed, I'd be caught in the shadows, in the place where the rules themselves went to die. As I turned, my eyes caught a glimpse of movement in the far distance, a flickering shape standing just by the edge of the escalator. It tilted its head, the face obscured by darkness, and I knew instinctively that I wasn't alone. I took a step forward, every muscle in my body screaming at me to turn and run. But the whispers of the rules held me in place. The flickering figure by the escalator did not move, yet I felt its attention pressing against my skin, cold and stifling. The whistle had died down, leaving behind an uneasy silence. The station seemed to lean in, waiting. Rule 6, the one I had memorized with a shiver each night, whispered in my mind, "If you see them, don't speak. They know your voice and it's their way in." The shadow at the escalator shifted, its limbs folding in on themselves like paper crumpling. I held my breath as it moved closer, gliding across the polished floor in a way that defied gravity. Its face came into view, pale as porcelain, eyes wide and unblinking, its lips curled into an expression I couldn't name. Something ancient and hungry. I staggered back against the information desk, the metal frame groaning under the pressure. My fingers clutched at the edge, nails digging in as I tried to regain my balance. The air was heavy now, thicker than any fog I had encountered. My heart drummed so loud that I thought it would split my ribs. I needed to move. I needed to be anywhere but here. But the rules held me down like chains. Rule 7, never turn your back on the platform. You never know who, or what, is waiting in the dark. I forced my feet to shift, my eyes never leaving the pale figure that continued its advance, footstep by careful footstep. The clock overhead seemed to grow louder, its ticking an ominous reminder that time was slipping away from me. Suddenly, a mechanical roar from the direction of track 4 startled me. I whipped my head around to see an old rusted train lurching forward, lights blinking on and off in a chaotic strobe. The windows were dark, but I could almost make out faint shadows moving inside, shapes that danced and contorted, their outlines shifting like smoke. It was the train I had seen in the orientation pamphlet, the one that supposedly never ran, that had been out of service for decades. And now, here it was, charging down the track with a cacophony of squeals and hissing steam. A voice echoed inside my head, low and serpentine. Rule 8, the train never comes. But when it does, don't try to stop it. Only one path ends with your survival. The figure by the escalator stopped moving, tilting its head as if listening to the train. Its eyes shifted to me, and in that moment, I felt as if it knew my every thought. The realization sent a wave of panic crashing over me. If the figure got any closer, if it caught me here when the train arrived, I would never leave this place. I wouldn't even be allowed to. The train thundered forward, metal and fire. I ran, heedless of the rules, knowing that if I didn't make it to the emergency exit at the end of the platform, I'd be swallowed whole by whatever this station had become. I barely made it 2 steps when I felt a cold, bony hand grip my shoulder. The hand was impossibly cold, like the touch of frostbite itself. I spun around, eyes wide with terror, and found myself staring into the face of the figure from the escalator. Its eyes had changed, no longer wide with a haunting, alien stare, but hollow, like deep pits that swallowed every ounce of light. It leaned in close, so close I could smell the stale, iron scent of blood on its breath. Rule 9, it rasped, its voice a broken whisper that came from somewhere beyond the realm of human speech. There's no escape when the whistle blows. I gasped and struggled, my fingers clawing at its grip, but it didn't let go. The train's deafening roar drowned out all other sounds, the metal shrieking like a beast in pain. My heart raced, thundering in my chest as the ground beneath me seemed to tilt and shift. The shadows, once distant, now coalesced into shapes of figures, their limbs twisted and eyes wide with silent screams. They pressed in from all sides, trapping me in an ever-tightening ring. "Run!" I tried to scream, but the words were choked and broken. The figure's mouth split into a grin, wide and hungry, revealing teeth like shattered glass. It whispered again, its voice winding around me like chains. The only rule that matters is the one you don't know. A sudden realization struck me like a lightning bolt. The whistle hadn't come from the track, it had come from inside me, from the part of me that knew I would never leave if I allowed the fear to control me. With every ounce of will I could muster, I closed my eyes and focused on the deepest, most primal part of my soul. The station quaked beneath my feet, a tremor so strong it sent waves rippling across the marble floor. When I opened my eyes again, the figure was gone. and the shadows had receded, leaving behind an unnatural, bone-chilling silence. The train had stopped as suddenly as it had started, its metal body now a rusty husk that glimmered with an unnatural light. I staggered forward, heart pounding, tears streaming down my face. And then, I heard it. A sound that pulled my spine straight and filled the pit of my stomach with dread. A whistle. It was low and soft, so soft that it seemed almost like a memory, but there was something in the way it resonated, something that left no room for doubt. I spun around to see the silhouette of someone standing at the far end of the platform, shrouded in mist, with a face I knew all too well, a face that haunted my dreams and kept me awake at night, a face I hadn't seen since that day. "You're not supposed to be here," the voice said, echoing through the station. It was my voice, but twisted and broken, cut with an eerie laugh that sent chills down my spine. The station's walls shimmered as if caught in a mirage, the lights flickering between black and white, between this world and the next. I reached for my phone, the screen cracked and pulsing with a dark red light. A message blinked on the screen. "Don't be here when the whistle blows." The whistle roared again, sharper this time, but not from the tracks. I stumbled back as the ground cracked, revealing blackness deeper than any shadow I had seen. The station, Grand Central, was no longer the place I knew. It was an echo, a void that cradled the lost and the damned. One final rule, one that I'd never seen before, screamed in my mind, as if carved by the station's breath itself. There are things you will never leave behind even when you leave. The lights went out, and I was alone. I stood in darkness, breath caught in my chest. A cold, slick sweat drenched my clothes, and the silence around me was a physical weight pressing down. I reached out, fingers brushing against the smooth surface of the information desk, and slowly I moved forward. The station felt like a living thing, a wound gaping open, its breath ragged with an inhuman pulse. "Why did you stay?" the voice whispered, echoing from every shadow, from deep within the crevices of the marble walls. It was my voice, and it was not. It was the voice of the station itself, wrapped in the cries of those who had come before me. I was still trapped, surrounded by the yawning blackness where light dared not linger. Every nerve screamed to run, to flee the suffocating grasp of whatever rule-bound cursed realm I had stumbled into. But the whispers called, drawing me toward the center of the hall, where the grand clock still loomed, now frozen at 12:15 a.m. Suddenly I remembered something. Rule 10. The last one to leave always brings a part of it with them. A flicker of movement in my peripheral vision made me stop. I turned slowly, the darkness shifting, forming into shapes that had once been human. They were spectral, their eyes hollow, their mouths open in soundless eternal screams. They reached for me, fingers made of fog, voices weaving a symphony of anguish. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Go! Leave before it's too late." I glanced at the cracked screen of my phone. The dark red light still pulsed, now accompanied by a single blinking word. "Run." As if answering the silent command, my legs pushed forward, stumbling through the station as the shadows grew restless. The echoes of the whistle rose, sharp and furious, shaking the foundations of the building. The air was electric, filled with static that clung to my skin, whispering secrets I couldn't comprehend. I reached the exit, the grand doors that were once magnificent but now scarred with deep gouges, splintered and bleeding rust. I forced them open and ran into the cool night air, the sound of the station fading behind me. I made it out. My chest heaved, eyes blurred with tears. I was free. But then I noticed it, a dark, shifting stain on my hand, as black as the void that had held me captive. It spread, creeping up my arm with unnatural speed. I staggered back, staring at my reflection in the glass of the station's outer walls. My face was the same, but something in my eyes had changed. They were wide, empty, hollowed out like those of the lost souls within. A soft whistle echoed from inside, and with it, the voice whispered once more, "You'll be back." The whistle always calls. My breath caught, and I knew then that Grand Central Station was not just a place. It was a part of me now, and no matter where I went, it would follow. The rules had marked me, branded my very soul, and when the next whistle blew, I would answer, because some doors, once opened, can never be closed.